David, thank you very much for joining us today. So much has happened since the last time we spoke. And during our last discussion, you said Trump would win by a landslide, and he has. The Republicans swept not only the White House, but the Congress and the Senate. And I'm curious what exactly you saw that you thought they would win by such a large margin.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I mean, I think actually it was all in the numbers. Actually, it was pretty obvious. In fact, actually, as you probably have heard, that Kamala Harris, team came out this last week admitting that their internal polls never had her actually ahead. It was so obvious because, again, if you look at, pollsters that have a good track record, I mean, what I'm talking about a track record are those that who have a pretty, who have figured out how to basically, make sure that they capture the so-called Trump supporters, because we know that there is this non-response bias among Trump voters, that they are less likely to participate in polls. That was the case in 2016. That was even the case in 2020. So, so pollsters like, Trafalgar, for example, they have figured out how to actually solve that problem. And therefore, if I just stick to their numbers, it was pretty obvious which way it was going to go, especially given if you look at the demographics. I knew that Trump was going to do much better among Blacks and Hispanics, and then there are plenty of those in Georgia and in Arizona. And on top of that, I was very skeptical about the Democrats, essentially the aspiration that they were going to basically get a lot of women to vote for them. In fact, all the female basically polls that I was following told me exactly the opposite was true. So I think from that point of view, I think the real big story in this election was that women did not vote for Kamala Harris the way that she was hoping on the abortion issue. And I think it's absolutely right, because like we tend to, people have a tendency to pigeonhole, voters. I mean, they assume that women only care about abortion, but yet they care about so many other issues as well, just like men. And I think, this shows there's no question that that's the reason why I think it was pretty obvious to me heading into the election that Trump was going to win by basically a nice margin, which is exactly what happened.
You and I have had discussions before about new media, like YouTube versus traditional media. And one of the things that really stood out to me in this election cycle was how Trump and his campaign team really embraced new media. And I'm not sure if you saw this stat, but Trump took part in 14 different podcasts. And from those, they got 124 million views just on YouTube alone. Never mind Spotify and Apple Podcasts and whatever platforms they were shown on. And then he was also, some of the bigger shows he was on was Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Lex Friedman, and a number of other ones. But then he was also going to NFL games. He was going to UFC fights. He even went to a Bitcoin conference in Nashville, whereas Harris took a totally different approach. She was on four different podcasts, but her approach was mainly traditional media, and that's where she spent all her money. I think it was over $1 billion. But what are your thoughts on this, and how do you think things change going forward?
I think it's amazing, actually, because I think, what does it tell you? Like, because if you think about this, 20 years ago when internet first became available, it was hoped that the internet was going to become a true, democratizing influence on the world, right? The idea was that we was going to basically give the little guys a voice, okay? And that corporate media would have to basically fight for their own space on the internet. So I think from that point of view, given that today, most people no longer trust, mainstream media, and largely to their own fault, by the way, and that more and more people get their news on the internet, YouTube, and that actually, I think, people have become more mature in the way they approach news, to the extent they don't just believe everything they read or they hear, whatever it is. So from that point of view, they tend to they treat things like opinions. So I think from that point of view, I think the fact that Trump won largely on the strength of, the support that he got from, people who get most of their news from YouTube, I think that says a lot about actually the political maturity of American voters. I think that means that they're now willing to basically make up their own mind about people instead of taking what somebody else says to do. And I think that's very, very important. I think, again, there are a lot of misinformation, but I think today people probably are more they're better informed, they're better educated about what are lies and what are not lies. And therefore they can consume, whatever information in general more intelligently and filter out the noise. And I think that says a lot. That's why I think, it's the smart people who voted Trump rather than the dumb people, as the Democrats would like to think.
The other thing I thought that was quite interesting too is how Harris went after the Hollywood celebrities. And that strategy just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I agree. I think in general, I think I learned it the hard way the last 3 years, right? Because when I launched my YouTube channel, I didn't even have a YouTube account. And then I'd enjoyed the celebrity status on Wall Street for 20 years. And then all of a sudden I joined YouTube, and then people didn't know me, didn't care what I had to say. As far as they were concerned, I would just basically I had no credibility and so on and so forth. I had to earn my credibility the hard way, every step of the way. And I think that's been amazing. So from that point of view, I think what is happening in this campaign also is that people are basically saying, you know what? A lot of people are born with a silver spoon, or they're famous, whatever it is. But these people, they don't know anything. They don't know what's good for me. They might not even know what's better for the country. So I think from that point of view, this is why I think, my experience with YouTube has been an eye-opener, because literally, you are engaging in debate with people I normally wouldn't have spoken to when I was working on Wall Street, right? And then I was only talking to people who had at least managing $1 billion, right? But now I'm talking to everybody, I'm having debates, that kind of thing, because you realize that's where things are really happening. And there's no easy way out, by the way, up on YouTube.
So I want to ask one more question about the election, and then we're going to move on and talk economics. But I want to talk about the vote count. In this election, Trump got 76.6 million votes. Harris got 74 million. In 2020, Biden got 81.2 million. Trump got 74.2 million. So there's a difference of 7 million votes between what Harris got this year and what Biden got in 2020. What happened to those 7 million votes?
Obviously, by now you probably heard, a lot of conspiracy theories about that this is actually proof that basically that the Democrats stole the election. It may be the case, may not be the case, I don't know. But I strongly suspect a lot of people who felt very galvanized, I'm talking about people on the left and also basically independents in 2020, they simply stay home this time. I think there was a lack of enthusiasm about Harris. I think ultimately the turnout among Democrats and independents was probably much lower than would have been otherwise. And I think from that point of view, yeah, it could be conspiracy theory. I have no idea which one is which, but I think there's a much more reasonable answer here. The reasonable answer is that people saw through her very quickly, actually. And I think to some extent, they wouldn't have seen through her as easily if it hadn't been, for the internet, all right? And I think to some extent, I have to say X probably also play a very big part. So from that point of view, all these basically platforms, very quickly took what she said, analyzed it, and put it out there so people could saw right away that she really didn't have much to say, actually. And I think that was what really did her in. And I think in the end, it's not so much people voted against her. It was the fact that people didn't come out to vote for her and people stay home. And I think that was the reason why she lost.
So that's enough of politics. Let's move on. I want to discuss some of Trump's policies that he's putting forth, and that's going to have a big impact on the economy. And one of his big economic plans is to use tariffs as a proverbial stick. And he recently announced that he wants to impose a further 10% tariff on China and a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. What are your thoughts on this? And what are your thoughts on tariffs overall? Are they good or bad for the economy?
I think, first of all, I'm not I think it's much too early to actually to say that, well, we're looking at big tariffs coming, this way. Okay, first of all, I think Trump always saw tariff as a negotiating tactic. I think from that point of view, there's nothing like tariff to get people's attention, right? And I think it's very important that Trump actually announced this new tariff 2 months, basically ahead of inauguration, meaning that gives these countries, whether China, Canada, and Mexico, 2 months to talk, to start talking. Otherwise, they probably will have no incentive to even talk to Trump. And now I'm sure, but I think there's something very, very interesting about this, first of all, to me. Okay. First of all, I actually think of this latest tariff announcement fascinating, especially the 25% on Canada. So only 10% on China and 25% on Mexico. And Mexico understand because of the border, but 25% on Canada. That to me is funny. And it's also interesting. And I think it really gets to the heart of what Trump really thinks about the world. I mean, we all know, okay, that since Trudeau became prime minister, 40,000 Canadians have died of the opiate crisis. In fact, the daily count is about 22 people, okay, dying every day in Canada because of the opiate crisis. And that has largely to do with policy under Trudeau. He has decriminalized drugs so that in many provinces, actually, the public health services will give out opiate to even minors and calling that safe supply. Okay? Now, this is killing Canadians. Obviously, this is one reason why Trudeau is already trailing, okay, big time in the polls ahead of the election that has to be held, as you know, by October next year. But to me, I have to believe that the Conservative Party probably met with this 25% tariff from Trump with glee, actually. They probably would like to do that themselves, basically, to Trudeau if they could. But I think that is actually very interesting. But I actually think that, because the Canadian election is just around the corner, technically speaking, I think the Liberal Party might decide, rather than slugging it out with Trump, to actually do a deal with him before that. Okay. And I think obviously where Canada's concerned is less about fentanyl, by the way. There really is about the rewriting of USMCA, which Trump didn't mention, but that's what it really is about, by the way. But he knows that this is going to hurt Trudeau personally, okay, because his unpopularity in Canada. That will only help focus this issue about the opioid, about what progressive policy has done to public health in Canada. That's why it was so clever in my view. With Mexico, already Claudia Sheinbaum already said, after the tariff crash, she already said, listen, within the next few weeks, there will be no more caravan heading up to the US. So the Mexicans it didn't even take them, it took them 24 hours to say that, we're going to take care of the immigration problem at our end. Okay. And as far as China is concerned, I think in general, obviously everybody is gung-ho. I mean, everybody believes that Trump really means it when he talked about the 60% tariff on China. I'm not so sure. And the reason why I'm not so sure is because of all the Trump's appointment, Scott Bessent, to me, basically his appointment, his nomination as Treasury Secretary made me really very happy. Because because I've known Scott, okay, as a client. I don't know him very well. But one thing I can tell you about Scott is the fact that Scott understands the US fiscal, basically, problems better than anybody else. And Scott understands that he has a better understanding of the problem and the solution better than anybody else I know. In fact, I would argue that Scott is what you would describe as a Bond vigilante. For Trump to pick someone like that over the objection of Elon Musk is very telling about Trump himself. I think most likely what it says to me is that Trump shares essentially Scott's concern about the fiscal problem and then potential revolt by the bond market. I have no doubt Scott probably told him, you know what, Trump, you want to basically raise tariff on China? If a 50% tariff on Chinese imports leads long-term interest rates to go up by just 30 basis points, you're going to be already worse off because you're going to end up paying more interest on U.S. debt obligation than you're actually going to collect in terms of tariff from Chinese imports.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to start with Canada. You made comments about Trump imposing a 25% tariff on Canada, and I can tell you, I'm based in Toronto, the politicians here are running scared. Probably within 48 hours, Prime Minister Trudeau got together with the premiers of Canada, and they were discussing that very thing. What are we going to do? Especially the premier of Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, 15 million people. And Premier Doug Ford, he is in a state of panic. So they don't know what to do, right? And they're trying to figure it out. And so there's a lot of concerns there. You made mention of the drug problem in Canada, and yes, there is a big problem, but I think for the most part, that's not a real concern with a lot of Canadians. The number one concern, of course, is the economy. The second concern is immigration, okay?
Yep.
And just as a reminder for our viewers, the Canadian economy is measured by GDP per capita. It's been declining for 5 years. Labor productivity, which is a big component of GDP, has been in decline for 9 years, okay? And so that corresponds with when Trudeau's been in office. And then in terms of immigration, in 2023, the Trudeau government brought in 1 million new people. Half of those people came into the city of Toronto or the greater Toronto area, which is 5 million people. So our population grew by 10% in 1 year. Just think about the stress that put on the transportation, the education, the healthcare system. And so these are things that are really resonating with Canadians. And this is why Canadians are so upset.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Trudeau is in serious trouble. I mean, this is why Trump has to think, because again, this USMCA is a very big thing, right? Because Trump wants to basically close the loophole in USMCA that allows China to export to, Mexico on its way to the US. Okay. And I think from that point of view, like in order to do that, they'll have to renegotiate USMCA to basically build in some kind of safeguard clause. And now, let's just say the Mexicans are willing. Trudeau last time was basically playing hardball. So from that point of view, like Trump needs to bring Trudeau to the table and basically get this thing moving quickly so he can get the leverage he needs vis-a-vis China. See, because this is why there's a lot of sequencing issue here that's very important. I think this 25% is really intended to, basically put a fire under everybody's seats, okay, to get them moving. And I think, Trudeau was always going to be the tough nut to crack, but I think this 25%, Trump's probably thinking it's going to do the trick, given already Trudeau is struggling at home.
So you mentioned Scott Bassett, that's Trump's pick for the Treasury, and Scott has laid out this 3-point economic agenda. He refers to it as 3, 3, and 3. And so he's looking for 3% growth. Economic growth is measured by GDP. He's looking to move the deficit from 6% of GDP down to 3%. And he also wants to increase production of oil in the US by 3%. They currently are the world's largest oil producer, 13 million barrels. He wants to increase that number by 3%. What are your thoughts on this plan?
By 3 million barrels per day, actually.
That's correct.
By 3 million barrels per day.
That's correct. And so what are your thoughts on this economic plan? Is it feasible?
Again, I mean, I think the issue is this. What we need to realize is this, right? I mean, whoever is going to be the Treasury Secretary in 2025, okay, has a huge problem, which is the fact that Janet Yellen, the outgoing Treasury Secretary, okay, had issued a pile of short-term debts, in fact, U.S. Treasuries, bills to finance the large budget deficit in 2024. In other words, all these bills are going to mature next year, and they'll have to get rolled over, okay? So from that point of view, what I'm telling you is that the gross financing, okay, needs of the U.S. government next year, federal government, is going to be easily over $3 trillion. Okay, so from that point of view, this is why, that will be a record number. And I'm really honestly don't know where that money's going to come from. Okay, and I'm sure Scott Bess and Trump are thinking the same, right? Because the rest of the world is pretty tapped out. The Chinese are not buying. The Japanese have limited basically appetite. Okay, the Europeans have already bought a truckload, and U.S. households in general, if they buy anything at all, they buy very short-dated, basically, treasuries. So who the hell is... So this is the reason why, in my humble opinion, you can grow the economy by 3%, but that's not going to help you that much in terms of bringing down, okay, basically your financing requirement, maybe a little bit if you can grow fast enough to generate a bit more tax revenue. But again, it's only going to be able to make a very small difference on the margin. Okay, you can try to basically pump 3 million more barrels of oil per day, but that's going to take some time. I mean, last time it took 4 years for them to basically raise production by 4 million barrels per day. So this time, I think like 1 million barrels per year, it will be a lot already. So all that is going to be very small. This is why I'm telling you, the issue right now, the 3% budget deficit target for next year is meant to basically provide an anchor. Okay, I'm not meaning for next year, they're talking about 2028. So the 3% budget deficit target for 2028, which will be the end of Trump's term, is really I think you should see that as what Scott Bessent wants to put out there as an anchor for the US bond market, therefore for the US stock market, because the stock market right now is very, very expensive. If long-term rates were to go up much more, like the stock market is going to be in deep trouble because the stock market has never been more expensive relative to the bond market since the dot-com bubble. So this again comes back to the issue. In order for everything for the circle to square, they have to cut spending next year. That's why the spending cut, that's why Elon Musk and Ramaswamy have been charged with the most important task, okay, for the Trump economic plan. But as I said before, but for them to succeed, Trump has to stop the war in Ukraine.
Okay, so why don't we talk about that now? And the Biden administration has been Ukraine's biggest ally, but that's all going to change as soon as Trump takes over. And Trump has said he's going to be able to end the war in Ukraine within the first 24 hours of him being in the White House. What are your thoughts on that, and how does he go about it?
I think it'd be, first of all, I think it's more difficult, than Trump might think. Because again, if he were just, if he was all powerful, he could end this in 24 hours because all he has to do is simply cut off support to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine right now is living on life support from the US. If it has no support from the US, the Europeans definitely are not going to be able to keep it going on their own. So as a result, Ukraine will have to surrender. But unfortunately, as I said before, Trump is up against the military industrial complex in the US that has every incentive to keep this war going for as long as possible. And then at the same time, Trump also remembers that they were trying to impeach him over, the Russian collusion charges. Those basic allegations can easily resurface. And of course, let's just say, I think that once we'll be on inauguration, maybe everything's going to be okay. But the point here is this: what Biden is trying to do, and the neocons and the defense establishment, everybody's trying to do right now, is to basically create a situation that will basically cause Putin to overreact, and then will give, NATO a perfect excuse to enter the war directly. So I think that's the whole point, which is this is the reason why. Just think about this. I mean, if Russian forces are streaming through, advancing across the eastern Ukraine, why is Ukraine using its NATO missiles against Russia and not trying to stop the Russian advancement in eastern Ukraine? Just think about that, how ridiculous that is, right? I mean, they're not. So from that point of view, it seems pretty obvious. Their goal right now is trying to provoke Putin into overreaction. Okay. And then, that's why, what they want is for Putin to, drop a nuclear bomb on Ukraine, or to attack Poland, or Estonia, so that it could play to their whole narrative that Putin is evil incarnate and he wants to conquer all of Europe once he's done with basically Ukraine. And that's what I'm saying, that they are trying to get under Putin's skin to cause him to overreact, so that the war will escalate, so that Trump will not be able to stop it, so that U.S. defense spending could remain a gravy train basically for the Pentagon and for all the defense contractors. Remember, in September 2020, 2 months before the 2020 election, Trump had a public spat with his top generals. He, in fact, publicly accused his generals of trying to unnecessarily prolong the U.S. foreign conflicts in order so that their buddies at defense contractors can sell more airplanes, more tanks to get more people killed. And you think any of these people want to see Trump return as commander-in-chief? I mean, this is why, 2 weeks into the election, in October, a few weeks, basically ago, all these generals, one after another, they were calling Trump Hitler, dictators, worse than Hitler, and so on and so forth. That is the issue. That's why I'm telling you, we can sit here and talk about so many different things about the economy, that kind of thing. But what I'm telling you is central to Trump's economic plan is stopping the war in Ukraine. And that war, the problem there, Trump is not fighting Russia or Zelensky. Trump is fighting the inside power within the U.S. who's trying to stop him.
It always comes back to money.
Exactly. It's money under the guise of American patriotism that they say, oh, well, Russia is the greatest threat to the U.S. We're going to take them out. We got to keep spending money in order to take out Russia before they finish us, whatever it is. Is that kind of, it's very, is this kind of false patriotism and then greased by the money that is basically literally pitching this fight.
So when we talk in a year from now, how do you think things look between Russia and Ukraine?
I don't think we need to go a year from now. I think, again, I think the issue right now is Putin can also see what's going on. Putin can see that, that they want him to blow up, the world, and then we're going to World War III and that kind of thing. And then I'm putting notes. Listen, the Russian economy in the last few months is showing clear signs of strain. Inflation is now running way over 8%. Food inflation is at 30%. Interest rates now at 21%. And then the ruble recently plummeted, actually. If it weren't for the intervention by the Central Bank of Russia, the currency would have gone down another 20% probably. And one thing I know is that Russia's foreign reserves, most of it is frozen under the Western sanctions, so that the central bank won't be able to keep up the intervention for very long. So I think Putin does have an incentive to negotiate. Especially if oil price keeps dropping, which I think it will, in 2025. But the point here is that, so I think that Putin understands that, Trump, again, we also know something else, which is that a month ago, we learned from, whatever classified documents, unclassified, that Elon Musk has been carrying on a regular conversation with, Putin over the last 3 years during the entire war. So there are many channels of communication between the Trump team. But I think what is important to understand is that right now, Trump is not coming out saying, "Oh, well, we shouldn't send weapons to Ukraine and so on and so forth," because he's going to be immediately labeled as a traitor, selling out to Russia and so on and so forth. But again, if Trump can survive this, if Putin can hold out for another 6 more weeks, I think things are going to be okay. I think the war will end fairly soon. In the first half of next year, in my humble opinion. But I think ending the war with Russia will have to be part of a grand bargain, with China and Russia. Because again, I think Putin doesn't quite trust Trump, and nor should he. Nobody trusts nobody in this war. This is a dog-in-dog world. So from that point of view, I think there are going to be 2 separate negotiations that are going to be negotiated simultaneously. U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia. But obviously, that's where it gets very interesting. So, but the point here is that I think the war will end, but what I'm expecting in terms of my portfolio, because at the end of the day, it's about investment strategy, as far as I'm concerned. It's about how to help my clients make money. I'm talking about my institutional clients. But the point here is that I just think that there's probably going to be at least one more round of escalation. And the next round of escalation is going to feel very scary. And this is the reason why I actually own a put spread on S&P 500 that expires just before, the inauguration.
One other question I want to ask before we leave Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and North Korea entered into a defense treaty, and North Korean troops have gone to Russia to train. What's the purpose of this?
Listen, the treaty, by the way, the treaty basically says, like any defense treaty, which is like, well, if, that one country is going to come to the rescue of the other country if the other country comes under attack. So right now, as you know, Ukraine has invaded Russia, right? Right now, most of the fighting is happening in Kursk, which is in Russia, inside Russia. So the North Koreans have been sent to fight the Ukrainian invaders. Now, the North Koreans not being sent into Ukraine to fight Ukrainians in Ukraine. They're fighting Ukrainians in Russia. So from Putin's perspective, that's okay. That hasn't crossed the red line. He just wanted to demonstrate to the West that basically that Russia can sign such agreement. By the way, where this is getting interesting, in my view, is that Iran has been lobbying Russia to sign a similar defense treaty. And that will be a bigger problem. And this is the reason why, by the way, Putin so far has been sort of hanging back. He hasn't agreed. He might agree if the West really push him too hard. But can you imagine, like in the future, if Israel should attack Iran, Russia will basically come to Iran's rescue so that the world is going to be fighting Russia every time it tries to, you know, eventually set back Iran's nuclear program. I mean, that will be scary. Okay. So I think from that point of view, that's another leverage, by the way, Putin does have on Trump. But I do think, however, this is where it gets interesting, because is Iran going to be part of this grand bargaining? I personally think not, simply because, like, I think, you know, obviously Trump wants to tighten. He wants to start, you know, enforcing existing sanctions on Iranian oil export. But right now, all of Iranian oil exports go to China. So you need the Chinese to play ball if you really want to basically tighten the screw on Iran. But I think neither Russia nor China are prepared. I think it's prepared to turn their back on Iran, because Iran is like an ally, is part of the BRICS group, and so on and so forth. And then Trump might also decide that the price of getting Russia and China to turn their back on Iran is too high, higher than he wants to pay. And guess what? I think this is why the clever thing for Trump is to decide to take Iran off the negotiation table. And the easiest way to do that is to get Israel to attack Iran. Iran's basically nuclear and oil facilities. So just basically take it off the table that way. Will be easier. But that's another reason why I think oil price has another leg up before it goes down.
Okay, so let's talk about the Middle East in a little more detail now. As a reminder, you are based in Israel. And what's your current assessment of what's happening in Israel and with Iran and also Lebanon?
I think, you know, the Lebanon ceasefire, I don't know, like, I think, you know, most Israelis think that there's only a 50% chance the ceasefire is going to hold. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. Already, like, you know, the Lebanese, you know, Hezbollah violated the ceasefire already twice today alone, which basically involved Hezbollah people redeploying to south of Litani, which is the agreement that they would be actually pulling away from. So as a result, Israel had to basically hit them. So what I'm just saying, like, you know, I think the deal happened partly because Iran wanted the deal to happen. Iran was pushing Hezbollah to agree to a deal, so as to give Iran an excuse not to attack Israel. Because if you remember, whatever, a few weeks ago, Iran was saying that it wanted to hit back at Israel after the Israeli attack on Iran back in October. But actually, immediately after the ceasefire was announced, Iran said, oh, wow, by the way, you know, that given the ceasefire, we might change our mind about the urgency of taking actions against Israel right now. So I'm not sure that deal is going to stick. But as I said before, I think the bigger question is really between Israel versus Iran. And I think, you know, the question again is whether Israel will try to take out Iran's, you know, oil and nuclear facilities before the inauguration. I would argue that is the biggest question, simply because Trump understands. I mean, like, it would make no sense, because if Trump were to come in, if nothing happens before Trump comes in, and Trump then tighten sanctions on Iran, oil price is going to go through the roof, right? Because everybody knows Iran exports about 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. I mean, if you have to find an extra 1.8 million barrels per day, you know, in the world, that's going to definitely push up oil prices. Trump obviously has no incentive for oil prices to go up, to jump that much, you know, in his first 6 months. So therefore, I think Trump has an incentive for oil prices to go up before he moves back into the White House. And this is the reason why I think, you know, we cannot rule out the possibility that Israel is going to go after Iran before.
So, David, when we look out into 2025, it's only a few weeks away, but can't believe that. But how do you see the markets ending like a year from now? What happens to the U.S. economy after Trump comes into power? You mentioned earlier that you think the S&P is highly overvalued, but does the S&P come under attack? Does the U.S. economy start to flounder? What are your thoughts?
I think, you know, listen, I don't try to think that far, because I mean, like, you know, anybody who pretends that they can think that far. I'm just looking, I mean, Wall Street comes up. I worked on Wall Street for 20 years. Everybody's putting out a year ahead, basically forecast 12 months ahead. You know, it means nothing, okay? Because at the end of the day, you know, your guess is as good as mine, because there's so many things that are difficult to predict. But the way I think about the world is very simple. It's in terms of risk rewards. Right now, everybody and their grandmother, okay, is along the US dollar, okay? Because they think a tariff war is coming and this is going to be bullish for the dollar. Everybody and their grandmother is short bonds, because they think tariff and tax cuts is going to blow up inflation and that interest rate is going to be much higher, okay? And everybody, grandmother right now is long the US stock market, thinking that this is all going to be great and so on and so forth. I'm right now taking the other side of the market. I've recently, just this week, I went from short the dollar to, I went from long the dollar to now short the dollar. I'm actually short the dollar against the Mexican peso, which I like because I think that's going to be the first deal Trump is going to cut. I think that we're going to see, I think Trump is much more fiscally responsible than people realize. I'm less concerned about a tariff war between US and China. And I think we're probably going to see a lot of savings once the war is finished in terms of on the federal budget side. So I'm actually long treasuries right now for the first time in over a year. And then because I'm worried about the war, I worry about deep state trying to sabotage Trump. I'm long and basically, as I said, I'm sure the US stock market through a put spread. I'm not looking for a 10% crash. That is, I'm looking just for a 3-4% move that will make me some nice money in terms of like risk reward before the inauguration. That's the way I'm thinking about the war right now. Try not to, I think the danger, most of these Wall Street people, whatever, we talk about a year from now, they couldn't possibly know. And if I can make money, if you cannot make money the next month, you're going to have, it's going to be much harder to make money on a 12-month view. That's what I can say.
All very good points. And you mentioned the dollar and how strong it is. And I'm in Canada, and so our dollar, I think it's at $1.41 or $1.42. And so when I go to the US, I'm paying like a 40% premium on whatever I buy. And if I use my credit card, you might as well round it up to 145. So it's expensive as hell. Like this US dollar is killing me.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this US dollar, I think this is the final analysis, which is, well, why is the dollar so strong? I would argue dollar has been very strong under the Biden presidency because the Biden presidency has basically resulted in this geopolitical fracturing in the world. And that geopolitical fracturing has been designed to benefit the US. This is why the dollar is so strong, right? So from that point of view, if Trump can bring peace back in the world, to the extent that countries are going to once again find it in their interest to cooperate with each other, or at least where there is win-win opportunities, guess what? Ironically, that would be bearish to the dollar. Okay. To the extent that right now, this decoupling between the US economy and the rest of the world is not sustainable. We're going to see recoupling in one way or the other. Whether that recoupling, if the only question is the form that recoupling is going to take, is it going to be because the US will be growing more slowly or the rest of the world growing faster? Either way, I think the dollar has peaked. And I think this is a time to be actually thinking about selling dollar as opposed to rushing into it when everybody and the grandmother's already along the dollar.
Well, David, those are all great points, and I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today. If someone would like to follow you online or learn more about your services, where can they go?
Yeah, check out my YouTube channel, David Wu Unbound. If you just want to, learn more about the way I think about economics, politics, geopolitics, and technology. And if you're more interested about my investment strategy, I do have a retail product. You can check that out on davidwuunbound.com.
I'm a subscriber to both, by the way.
Okay, great. Thank you.